Well, first of all, thank you very much for coming. I know it's a beautiful day, so I appreciate you taking time out from enjoying nature and coming here. I get often asked why I would do this book on famous art, and particularly why I would do it on intuitive reactions. So I'm often lucky in life, and in 1997, I was writing a book for my company's president about the customer experience. And someone he knew at IBM sent over an article from a now deceased Cornell University publication talking about the breakthroughs in brain science and how people really make decisions. And that faxed over article changed my life. My hands were literally trembling when I finished reading the article. Probably the most striking statistic was that the conservative estimation was that at least 95% of our mental activity is not fully conscious. I just checked with the leading scientists the other day, and apparently now they are estimating it's actually 98% plus. So that has held up over the past 20 years. But that fundamentally changes how we understand human nature, and also I think how we appreciate art, which I'll be talking about today. And I'll be using two tools that I've used in market research to help companies sell more baked beans and everything else under the sun. But since I was an art history minor in college, my mom was an interior designer, my wife's an artist, I've always been really interested in the power of art. So this was my opportunity to take those same tools and apply to something I thought was more meaningful and more enduring than an ad campaign or packaging or other such things. So when I do this study, or did this study, it is the largest one ever done involving one of the two tools, which is called eye tracking. And I'll explain the tool for you in a moment. But the largest study that I know that was ever done was about 40 subjects. They were all the professor's students, probably told that they better show up for the laboratory, otherwise they weren't going to pass the course. And they merely saw 12 Zurbarans. So nothing against Spanish art, but a very limited sample, both in terms of students, demographically, in terms of variety, and then in terms of the artwork itself. So this is many multitudes larger than that. First of all, in terms of subjects involved, I have nearly 100 people, and I worked really hard to try to go for diversity. Now, being from Minnesota, where a lot of my test subjects were, that's not always easy. We say in Minnesota we have diversity because we have both Norwegians and Swedes. But these days, we're a little bit more varied than that. I have actually people from age 6 to 80 plus who are in the study. So considerable variety. It was particularly fun to do the young kids and their reactions to art, quite honestly. And then in terms of the artwork itself, that was almost the most painful part, because when you love art, the idea that you're going to limit it to about 88 works of art and which ones you're going to pick and leaving out numerous favorites becomes very difficult. But what I did try to do is get across different continents and very definitely across different eras. So it runs from the Renaissance up through and into the 21st century. I actually have about 1/5 of the artwork is from this century. So I didn't want it to be just retrospective. And then I worked really hard to have not just paintings, but also sculptures, ready-made pieces, and a pretty large dose of photography as well. So the study in terms of the demographics, I can tell you, actually ended up being pretty close to who goes to museums. So I managed to pull that off despite not having a Ford Foundation grant to help me defray the cost and all of those sweet things. Anyway, that's just a bit of background, and I like to promise you this is the most boring slide that I will have, and it'll go upward from here. So, although I do remember one time being at a business conference, and the person just before me was from Walmart, and if it says anything about the psychology of Walmart, they were really relieved when I took the stage because I had a sense of humor and I had visuals. He just had numbers. Every slide was packed full of numbers. No human beings whatsoever. So we're on to the first of the tools, and then I'm going to explain something about the genesis to the study. So let me tell you about the tool first, and then before I get the results, I'll tell you about the background to the study. So this is called eye tracking. You may or may not know of it. It's been around for about a century. Approximately the same time that Gustav Klimt did the KISS, we had the first eye tracking technology. In those days, it was so complicated that it was like going deep sea diving. They put all sorts of equipment on you and set it up, and they ran with it. These days, it's so simple. It's not so inexpensive, but it's so simple that in our case, the test subjects sat in front of a laptop. No, I did not put them on planes and take them to the Louvre and to the Met and every place else. It was in a stationary setting all the artwork seen similarly. But it meant that they could sit in front of the laptop, and amazingly, because I'm not very technically savvy, amazingly, within about 15 to 20 seconds, it can pick up where your eyes are, and as they start moving, it can track your eyes. So it will follow, in terms of fixations, how long you stay with a detail. And what we now know from the technology, from brain science, you have to stay with a detail for at least 1/6 of a second minimum for it to mentally register for you. So if you move too quick, it doesn't really get a mental toehold with you. So that's called a fixation. Another thing you should know about eye tracking as we get into the results is they're called heat maps. And you can kind of see that in the top right. If it has oranges or reds, that means the test subject stayed with that detail longer, and on average. So the darker the colors in terms of orange and red, then lots of people for lots of time tended to go there. Green would be more peripheral vision, and black is basically they didn't take it in. Didn't particularly happen for them. So that's how that works. Then before I explain the results, I want to tell you how the study started. So I was in New York on a business trip. I had some spare time. It may not be the typical business person who would do this, but in my case it meant I went over to the Brooklyn Museum, the Frick Museum, and the Guggenheim Museum. And being a market researcher, I suddenly started noticing just how quickly people looked at the artwork. Anyone want to guess how long the average person, based on my informal study over a couple, 3 days, just watching people, 10 seconds? Anyone else want to give a guess? 3 seconds. You're actually closer. Wow. What I discovered, and there were instances certainly where some people would stay with a particular artwork 20 seconds, 30 seconds, a minute and a half. But if you looked at what was most typical, it was 4 seconds. Then they would look at the nameplate explaining the artist's name, when the painting was done, what country they're from. They would do that for 5 seconds. Then they would often go back to the artwork for 1 more second before they moved on. So you could arguably get to 5 seconds, but they didn't always do that. Sometimes they read the nameplate and that was the last thing they did. And if you're looking at a nameplate, the average person can read about 4 words a second. So that meant they got about 16 words into the nameplate, no more than that. So what I did in my study is I was quote unquote generous and I gave them 15 seconds. And at the 8-second mark, I would say aloud to the test subject looking at the screen, I would say aloud to them the artist's last name and the title of the artwork. So that was kind of a second prompt after they were partway into it. So remember those 3 museums, 4 seconds of viewing time. I did not know how this test would turn out, but if you look at the fixations, which is that mental toehold of when people were most inclined to seize on details in the artwork and stay with it long enough for it to register, it's really front-loaded. It is pretty much the first 4 seconds, and then it's dropping away. So what I saw in New York was not happenstance. It was essentially reality. And these were, in this study are some of the greatest artworks ever, and in a setting where you didn't have to pay a museum fee, you didn't have to get in your car, this was pretty easily done, and yet 4 seconds was the kind of their mental load to take it in, and then it drops away. You can see there's a little bit of a lift at second 9, because I've just started to give them the artist's last name and the title of the artwork. So there's a small little pickup, but basically they're out of there. If we can go to the next slide. So this is the other tool, and no one has ever done this. The Peabody Museum, which is an excellent museum northeast of Boston, has done some studies where they've looked at arousal using skin conductance measures. But they have not been able to get to specific emotions, and they have a proxy for engagement, emotional engagement or interest. The tool that is stronger and can do both the amount of arousal and whether you like something or don't like something and which specific emotions is called facial coding. And this is what I brought into market research, because when I read that article from the Cornell University publication, I basically said to myself, this is really cool stuff. This completely changes the game in terms of how we understand human nature. This takes Rene Descartes' famous comment, "I think, therefore I am," and throws it right out the window. It's more like, I feel, therefore I am. I sense, therefore I am. I am an intuitive being, therefore I am. I thought that was personally really liberating. The idea that we are not Mr. Spock from Star Trek, we are Homer Simpson from The Simpsons. That we make decisions out of altruism and greed and laziness, but that we are human beings, profoundly human beings, and I thought that was just great. I had no idea whether I could make a living doing this in business, but I thought it's just too cool not to try. And then I went on the hunt looking for tools that would actually allow me to capture people's feelings. And what I came across was the fact that facial coding originated first with Da Vinci, Leonardo da Vinci, and then with Charles Darwin, who essentially said, emotions must be there for a reason. They must give us an adaptive advantage. Otherwise, they wouldn't be around. And he was the first one to realize that in your face, you best reflect and communicate your emotions, because those expressions are universal. Even a person born blind emotes the same way as you or I. That we have more facial muscles than any other species on the planet, because we're intensely social beings and we use it to reflect and communicate how we're feeling. And that the face is the only place in the body where the muscles attach right to the skin. It is quick, real-time data. And there's probably an autobiographical reason why I'm a facial coder, which is my father worked for the 3M company, and when I was 6 years old, literally on my birthday, we flew to New York. I suddenly found myself in Italy, not knowing the language, going to Italian first grade in a fishing village, and waiting all day for the math unit so I could have something to do. Italians are a little bit famous for body language. They're very expressive people. That's probably why I'm a facial coder. And as we left Europe to come back to America, my mom, loving art, took us, well, been taking me to a lot of museums. In this case, we stopped at the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam. And I fell in love with Rembrandt as a 7-year-old. Rembrandt, of course, is incredibly amazing portraiture work, penetrating understanding of human expressions. I went to his hometown on his, I think it was what, his 400th birthday. And they actually had a little display about how he had one other rival as a child artist, but everyone already from the age of like 12 knew that Rembrandt was incredibly good at picking up expressions and depicting them. So facial coding is a means to track, based on 23 different expressions, what emotions people are showing on their faces. Happiness and surprise, and then fear and anger, sadness, disgust, and contempt. Yes, arguably more of them are negative than positive, but guess what? We read other people's faces to stay alive. We hear bad news more loudly. We need to know what's going on. If you have never been lied to in life, congratulations. You are either extremely lucky or you're not paying attention. Human beings engage in lip service and grade inflation. And so reading faces is a good survival mechanism to essentially know whether someone's against you, not with you, so on and so forth. So using facial coding, because the eye tracking technology, because I was the first researcher in America to use it, once they realized I wanted to combine it with facial coding, they added a little camera on the front side of the eye tracking machine. So that allows me to then also get video files to go through and study people's expressions and reactions. So in this case, we're going on how much emotional engagement. In other words, how much does their face light up? How much do they turn on, become interested intuitively in what's going on the screen? And this is even more front-loaded. I told you 4 seconds in New York. Here it's arguably even 3 seconds. It is in Green Bay Packer, Chicago Bear, football terminology. This is hut, hut, hike, and the play is on. It moves that quickly. And in fact, what we know from neuroscience is that the average person will make a decision on any matter, large or small. The neurochemistry is such that we typically make our decisions in 1 second or less. 1 second or less. We think we're rational beings. We think there's this long afterburner where we're reasoning it out, but they're pretty sure scientifically now that we make these gut level decisions super quickly, and they just happen. With the artwork, you get 3 seconds, it seems. So very much front-loaded. Let's go to the next slide. So naturally, I felt like I should go ahead and help decode for you the most famous painting ever, and that would be Da Vinci's Mona Lisa, of course, the painting that Napoleon took out of the Louvre, by the way, and put in his private apartment in Paris. And Da Vinci, as I mentioned earlier, was probably the world's first real facial coder. If you look at his notebooks, they have drawings where he is looking at the anatomy of the face. Because both Da Vinci and Michelangelo were scientists as well as artists, and they became fascinated with dissection. So much so, in Michelangelo's case, that the Pope told him to cut it out, pun intended. And in Michelangelo's case, he was very interested in the body. That's why you have David and all the muscle activity that he's capturing. In Da Vinci's case, he was more interested in the face. And so with Mona Lisa, when we say a Mona Lisa smile, we always know that means there's more going on than just a smile. It's not a straightforward, I'm a happy camper with Mona Lisa. And indeed, that's true. So one of the things she shows on the face is contempt, a smirk. And a smirk shows unilaterally on the face, almost always just on one side of the face. And it tends to be a small upward movement, a little bit of a tension. It looks like a smile, but it sure ain't a smile, because it means I don't trust you, I don't respect you, I find you beneath me. If you've read Malcolm Gladwell's bestseller Blink, which talks about facial coding has been used in marriage counseling, for instance. And with 15 minutes of videotape facially coded, a 90% accuracy rate if the couple will stay married. 90%. Contempt is the most reliable indicator that it will fail. I don't trust you, I don't respect you, I find you beneath me. I've used facial coding, by the way, in speed dating. We have 100% accuracy whether the man or the woman wanted a second conversation with the other person beyond the initial foray. Because you give it away on your face, how you're feeling. So one thing, this woman, the sitter, who is almost certainly the wife of a very successful Florentine merchant, one of the expressions she shows that I think is interesting is contempt. I didn't get a chance to have a conversation with her. I'm not sure why she's showing it. She probably wouldn't know herself necessarily consciously, but there are some things that could make sense. First of all, they were a very different social status. She was, wealthy in the merchant class. He was an artist. Yes, we know him as a genius. He wasn't necessarily known as a genius at the time. What was known was that he was from a small town. He was born illegitimate, which would be very much a mark against him in that closed-knit society. And he was almost certainly either gay or bisexual. So he was not within the norm. And she was very much riding on the top part of what was acceptable in society. Did she possibly consider him beneath her? I think it's possible. The other one I think is interesting is anger. One of the ways in which anger can show in the face is when the muscle below the lower eye gets taut and straight. Very reliable sign that someone's not terribly happy with you. You've aggravated them for one reason or another, for instance. She also shows it a bit in the what's called a chin thrust, where the chin pulls up, which also reveals, besides anger, sadness and disgust. So two places where anger is happening. And why might she show anger? I would suggest the reason could be that Da Vinci was a perfectionist. It took him as long to do the original stage of doing this very small painting as long as it took Michelangelo to do the entire Sistine Chapel ceiling. That's how much time he took on this tiny little canvas. And that wasn't even the end of it. When he left Florence to go to the royal court, be the court painter in Paris, he took Da Vinci, he took Mona Lisa with him. It rode on the back of the mule and he walked to Paris. He continued working on it until his death. So is there a possibility she got a little bit irritated with this guy who just wouldn't get it done, wouldn't put it aside, kept insisting she came back to the studio? I think it's possible. So let's go to the next one. This was the most successful piece in my study. And if you're like most of the people I presented to in various cities, you will go, huh? What? Why? Why is this succeeding? And I think there's some reasons why it succeeded. First of all, the background. So this is by Tracy Emin. She is a British artist. She did this in 1999. It's in the Tate Gallery in London. And this is the very same bed in which she retreated into I guess you can call it a romantic funk after relationship ended. So pretty much not leaving her bed. This is where she habitated for about 3 weeks or more straight. Alongside the bed are things like an empty vodka bottle, cigarette carton, nylons. Behind the bed, the luggage she eventually put her belongings into and went off on vacation to get away from her funk. But all these kind of debris, as it were, from her romantic post-interlude. And I think the reason why this works so well is because beds are so central to our lives. They have so much emotional resonance for us. They, after all, quite likely where we were born, quite likely where we will die, where we made love, where we slept, took naps, lots of times and lots of intimacy and lots of significant events happen in beds. And everybody, whether you're 6 or 80, can relate to a bed. And I think that's why it worked. But that's not the only explanation I'm going to give. If we can go to the next slide. So everyone knows Picasso. Because I got a learned crowd here, you would know Brock, his co-contributor in creating Cubism. And likewise in psychology, you've certainly heard of Freud, but you probably haven't heard of a man named William Wundt, who was the co-creator of psychology. And William Wundt was likewise from Central Europe, and he created something called Wundt's curve. And having tested all this advertising for major companies around the world, and now doing this art study, I would tell you this is the most reliable theory I've ever come across. If you are a practicing artist yourself, for instance, this is the most reliable formula I've ever seen to explain what can break through with people and what fails to break through with people. So let me kind of take you through the diagram quickly. So the left north-south axis is basically emotional intensity, how much of a reaction you have and how strong, intense a reaction you have. Across the bottom is negative, what I call appeal. Valence, is it positive, negative, which way do you go? And so let's start with the top left. So I can tell you from all my advertising testing that this is where creative directors at ad agencies like to go to. It might be where artists like to go to. I'm a former poet. It's probably where I like to go to. Is it a good place to go to? Probably not. Because what it typically means is that you create something that is both complex and novel. In other words, you are asking your audience to work really hard at something, and they're only giving it 3 to 4 seconds of juice. So there's a really good chance that you've just, as a student of mine once said in class, great lecture, Professor Hill. And then he left. In other words, I lost him. I might have thought it was a great lecture, but I was indulging myself, I guess, and it just didn't connect. And if it doesn't connect, it doesn't really matter in a lot of ways in the end. So that's where the creative directors like to go. I can tell you from my business experiences, simple and familiar is where their clients like to go. You know, I don't want to get fired by the CEO. I'm going to sign off on something that's really easy, obvious, been done a million times, and I'll play it safe. In other words, they are choosing applesauce, not apple pie. And that's where they tended to go. Neither one of those is the sweet spot. The sweet spot instead, Wundt argued, and I think he's right, is first of all, always give them the toehold. You don't have much time. Give them some way in. And the way in could be familiar or it could be simple. You can go either direction. And then you complicated it. You put some sizzle with the steak. You twist the knife and you give them the complex or the novel to make it richer and have some afterburn. And I think it's just brilliant. So in the case of Tracy Emin's bed, you got something really familiar. And then you got a whole lot of complexity because of all the things that are strewn on and around the bed. And I think that's why it works. Next slide. So I'm going to take you through some other insights as well. And eventually we're going to get to the Q&A, which is by far my favorite part. See where I lost you, where I went like this for you, unfortunately. But also what's of interest to you and where you want to take the conversation. But let's run through some of these. So one thing that's really important, particularly if you happen to be an artist or even just an artist lover, is how important the face is. And I don't say this because I'm a facial coder and because of Rembrandt only. I say it because it's what I've seen over and over and over. Whether it's eye tracking with the fixations, or emotionally with the facial coding and engagement. Typically, 60, 70% or more of people's interest goes to the face if there's a face involved in the painting or the photograph. We are so oriented to faces, and there are reasons why. First of all, think about it. 4 of our 5 senses sit on our faces. That is the headquarters for sight and hearing and smell and so forth. Only touch is the only one of the 5 senses that doesn't have its headquarters on the face, so to speak. We look at faces because it gives us an idea of your race and gender and age. It gives us a sense of your identity, therefore. It also tells us your mood or personality. George Orwell, the writer of 1984 novel, famously said at one time, "By the age of 50, a man has the face he deserves," which I think is just great. And it could be a woman as well, because we have muscle memory. We have muscle memory and patterns, and we have certain proclivities. We are habitual creatures, and we fall into certain things. We say someone is a hothead or a sad sack or whatever the case may be because they have certain characteristic expressions and emotions that they tend to fall back into. I can tell you, for instance, I've done a lot of work on presidential campaigns, and one time I was in Iowa, it was 2008, and John McCain was running, and he started complaining about the bridge that had gone down in Minneapolis and how we needed to pay attention to infrastructure. Well, I was really interested in that part of his conversation because, honest to God, I passed under that bridge 1 minute before it came down. 1 minute on my way home from work. But I started laughing almost because John said, "This makes me really mad." And I've facially coded John a lot. And a lot of things made John mad. It wasn't just the bridge. But I was sitting so close to John that I didn't dare smile too much because John had once been a boxer back in his Navy days, and I didn't want John punching me. So I just tried to keep as straight a face as I possibly could. But we do have tendencies. So let's go through these artworks. On the left, you have the very famous down in Chicago, the American Gothic by Grant Wood. He's passing through a small town in Iowa. He notices the Gothic window. Now, I like the small town because it's the town of Eldon, Iowa, and my dad's first name is Eldon. Not a very common name. The Gothic window does not succeed so well, though, in my study. People didn't particularly look there. They also didn't look at the pitchfork, which, arguably could be a weapon. And you would think they might pay attention to that. You would think they might particularly pay attention to it because notice how hard the guy is holding the pitchfork. It really looks like it could be a weapon. But that man who's supposedly a farmer is actually Grant Wood's dentist. And I don't think he's any happier to be the sitter than Monalisa was to wait around and wait for Da Vinci to get done. And the woman is Grant Wood's sister. And it is the face, the face, the face that they take in. If we go over to Gainsborough's famous artwork, his most famous painting, arguably, the truth of the matter is Gainsborough hated doing portraiture. He loved doing landscapes. Why did he take the assignment? Because he needed the money. He was a young artist. This was the richest couple in the neighborhood. They were willing to pay him handsomely to do the portraiture after their wedding. How did he get his revenge? He moved them over to the left third of the canvas so he could mostly get his famous landscape in instead, his beloved landscape. Then, if you look closely, you can actually see that where her hands are resting on the dress, he didn't finish the painting. That's raw canvas. It's like, I'll take your money, but I'm not actually even going to finish the painting for you. But the final revenge is on him because where do people look? The faces, not so much at the landscape. It's just how it works. Next one. We also look at faces really quickly. So this is an artist named Andrew Vicari, and if you're like me, you would say, who? Because when I was trying to pick out the artists who would be in my study, at one point I said, well, one way I could think about it is who made a lot of money doing art? Maybe that's one criteria I should use in my study. So I found the list online, Googled it, of course. And you have Andy Warhol and all the people I expected to see. And then you had this guy named Andrew Vicari. I was like, huh? Who? What? It turns out he was a Welshman who managed to become the court painter for the people in Saudi Arabia and Dubai and Kuwait. He made boatloads of money doing portraitures for Arab sheiks. And so this is just one instance where people go to the face really quickly, more quickly than on average than they'll go to the clothing, to the background, to elements of nature and so forth. It's the face, the face, the face, and it's the face really quickly. Next thing. Does the face beat out the body? Simple answer is yes. Even when the body is kind of noticeable, like the self-portrait where the hand that he wants to emphasize is an artist, so the hand is way out front in the convex mirror. Even with Rodin's The Thinker, the legs are massive, massive, and yet the face still easily beats them out. It just happens over and over and over. Some of the people have theories about how you look through a work of art. That you have certain patterns that you're going to use. And I'm going to give you a pattern in a moment, but there was somebody who gave the idea that some of the patterns were actually based on the alphabet. Well, our brain's really ancient and the alphabet's relatively more recent, so I was not terribly surprised that this didn't hold up. And this person's theory was, yeah, kind of like the letters C or Z and so forth. No, this is fixations. This is one person looking at Fragonard's The Swing. The number refers to that was the first fixation when they gazed at it. Second fixation, third fixation. The size of the bubble is how long they stayed with it, how big the fixation grew. And you can see basically what is happening. It's like a water bug on a pond. They are jumping around like crazy. Just that's how it works. Next slide. But there is a pattern on average, somewhat. But the most obvious pattern would be that we tend to come up through the middle, starting in the lower foreground. We come up through it, and we will jump to the four corners, which I sometimes call Outer Mongolia. But I have a special designation for the lower right-hand corner, which I call the corner of death. And that is from my time doing things in business, because where do ad agencies like to put the brand logo? They almost always put it in the lower right-hand corner of the website page and the print ad. In other words, a place where very likely the consumer is never going to see it. And so the advertising is unbranded. The client has just spent their money on promoting the category instead of their particular product. And it happens over and over and over. Those numbers on the right, by the way, are the fixation counts across the test subjects who saw this particular artwork. So in other words, there was 407 fixations for the top middle portion of the painting by Pollock. And you can see in the corner of death, there was merely 66. A very low number, but the lower left is even smaller, 65. So that's kind of a general pattern. Next one. So I was also curious, because I tried a lot of hypotheses. In a few cases in the book, I mentioned ones that didn't pan out. I'm showing you ones that did pan out where there was enough statistical separation that I could say that's an outcome for you. So one thing I wanted to know was, is it likely that an orientation that's vertical versus horizontal versus diagonal would be most likely to generate interest from people? And if you had asked me going into the study, my guess would have been diagonal, which means I shouldn't go to Las Vegas anytime quickly because I lost. What actually very strongly won was a vertical orientation. And I've tried to go through the art books and find a reason why, and no one's talked about this. No one has any kind of similar tools or results to share. My guess, if I had to guess, but then I shouldn't go to Las Vegas, my guess would be that we kind of like to think about the trajectory of lifting ourselves up, of having hope versus gravity and getting pulled down in life. And there might be an underlying kind of psychological storyline there that's very powerful for us. That would be my guess. I could not defend it in a court of law, but that's what I'm sticking to until someone gives me a better theory. I was also curious about shapes. Would humankind, human-made squares, diagonals, things like for refrigerators and TV sets, would that win out? Would kind of the organic circle of nature run out? Would triangles work out tops? The triangle less so than the vertical orientation was the winner here. I don't have necessarily a theory why. It does have 3 pointy edges, but a lot of times the triangles are a little more suggestive than hard, fast details in an artwork. But that's how it came out. Colors. Naturally, I wanted to know how colors did. From an eye tracking perspective, you could probably say the green one, which would be the color of nature. Guess what? If you go back to us on the savannah, on the Great Plains, we had to fare our way through the forest. We had to tell the trees from the forest. So it would make sense that we might use eye tracking to detect how we should proceed. But emotionally, red was the most engaging color. You know, it signifies, for one thing, potentially blood, which definitely gets our attention and arousal because we're oriented to survival. But blue was the most appealing. And I do know from studies, very often blue wins, I think because it connotates blue, sunny skies day, water, for instance, you know, things that keep us alive and bring enjoyment. One thing I wanted to say, I've already shown you, this is a little more of a close-up where you can see the canvas in the Andrews painting and the fact that it's left unfinished. But it's the one on the right that I wanted to speak to more. It's one last foray back to the face, as it were. So I didn't really realize this until I was looking at the results. And then I said, you know, Michelangelo was really gutsy. Maybe I missed it. I can't find a single other work of art where someone dared to depict the face of God. Only Michelangelo was prepared to go there. And guess what? It grabs the attention. You're not only going to give me a face, you're going to dare to give me the face of God? I'm going to look. And then you got all the cherubs around it. And that beats out the famous figures touching. That beats out the nudity of Adam. So you're beating out storyline and male nudity in favor of God's face. That's pretty strong stuff. Next slide. Titles. As I told you, 5 seconds typically on the nameplate, which equals or surpasses the amount of time spent on the artwork itself. That's why I incorporated into the study giving the last name of the artist and the title of the artwork. This was the most successful title in the study. It is Mondrian's Broadway Boogie Woogie. First of all, it's just a really fun title, Boogie Woogie. Second of all, it's got a great storyline behind it. So Mondrian has fled war-torn Europe. He's gotten away from Hitler. He comes to New York. On his first night in Manhattan, he is taken to a jazz club. Never heard jazz before, loves it. This is one of his last works, his most important last among his final works. And when the students and young kids and adults and everybody saw this, that title sang for them because especially some of the kids couldn't help but blurt out, oh my God, the yellow is taxi cabs, or the yellow is the lights on Broadway. And the gridiron is seemingly being suggested in Manhattan by his famous shapes that he normally went to with the horizontals and all of that. And it just all clicked for them, and they lit up. Now, that's not the only instance of a title making a difference, but this is what I found. So meaningful titles, kind of poetic, fanciful titles, those worked really well. I don't know about you, but titles that say number 97 or untitled, those didn't tend to sing to people so much. They did not test well. Also, if you have terms in your title of your painting that no one knows, chances are you're not communicating really well. So next one, back to where you were. So the other thing with facial coding, and then we have a little fun thing, and then we'll do the Q&A. So the other thing you can do with facial coding is you can actually get to the specific emotions people felt. And typically, human beings will feel anger and happiness the most. That's actually about 70% of our emoting typically. And I know that in part not just from my market research work, but I looked at 173 celebrities who are movie stars and rock stars and politicians and everything else to see how they emoted. And so it is anger and happiness that really dominates most of our emoting, and the other emotions are kind of accent points. That said, I did not expect a lot of happiness to Munch's The Shriek. For one thing, my first father-in-law was an art historian. He was Norwegian. He was a Edvard Munch scholar. Certainly if I didn't know otherwise, I would know from him that this was very much a painting based on mental anguish in the Munch family, mental illness and so forth. And yet people took it with not big smiles, but with wry smiles. And yes, some people might have just thought it was over the top, but there's probably one other explanation, which is, I don't know if you've ever had one of these, but I used to own one of those plastic blow-up dolls that imitate the Shriek. Particularly popular for people who are suffering through office politics and want some sort of reprieve. And so I've seen in people's offices even like the 4-foot version of it. I bought the 1.5-foot size one, but I've seen the full McCoy before. So some people could take it with some irony instead of what Munch had in mind, which just shows you the artist doesn't necessarily control people's reactions or how the work is interpreted or what it might even mean beyond the artist's conscious awareness. The one on the right really threw me as well, because for most people, contempt is maybe 3 to 5 to 7% of someone's emoting. Unless you're Bill Gates, in which case it's a lot higher. But in this case, it was very high. 29% of all the emoting for the people who saw this artwork had that reaction. So my wife takes classes at the Atelier School in Minneapolis. So one day I showed up at lunchtime, so I knew the artist would be taking a lunch break. And I wanted to share this result with them. And I just said, can you help me out at all? Why in the world would people have this reaction? And they came up with 2 theories, which I think make a lot of sense. Some of them said, well, you know, the couple doesn't seem very equal in status. He looks older. He seems to convey that he's in more of a power position of the two. My feeling is I don't like trophy wives. I don't like unequal marriages. He seems like a bit of a cold fish. And I just kind of back off from the whole thing. To which I would add, not only does he look like a cold fish, I think he looks like Vladimir Putin. Yes, sorry about that. The other people had one other explanation, which they said, well, maybe I'm a bit more conservative, but I don't think you're pregnant when you get married, or you shouldn't be. And my reaction's based on that. And so that was some other people's reactions. But either way, or for some other, door number 3 reason that we do not know, people had a lot of contempt reaction to that particular artwork. Okay, let's go to the last little fun part. So because I've been in commerce, because art is commerce and they get sold for astronomically high prices, and because the artwork gets repurposed in advertising, I wanted to take some instances where there was either what I thought was a really great use of the famous artwork or a really terrible, crappy, stupid way that it got used. So just a few of these to close this out. So of course, Mona Lisa first. On the left is what I think is a pretty successful one, particularly if it was truly Mona Lisa's smile, because it's for Belgian chocolate. And if you've ever had Belgian chocolate, it tastes awfully good, and it certainly makes me smile. And I can remember one time I was in the Ecuadorian Amazon, and we were through a pair of guides and translators. We were talking to someone who was the tribal chairperson for a tribe that had just come out of the jungle like 20 years earlier. I mean, very ancient. And everybody got to ask a question, and I saw all the different expressions on his face. But the one thing he hadn't shown so far in kind of this little interview format, he had never shown any happiness. So when I got to ask the last question and my question, I said to him, ever had chocolate? Big smile. It's universal. So I think that makes a lot of sense. This is translated. This is from a German online dating site. I think this is a terrible use of Mona Lisa. First of all, he looks a lot happier than she does. Second thing is he looks kind of grabby and possessive, like the jealous type. Notice how he's holding onto her arm and clutching her arm. So does this inspire the idea you're going to find happiness by going to online dating? I don't think so. Only if you're German, yes. So this one is, of course, from the creation of Adam. The one on the left is actually from a burger chain, upscale burger chain in Chicago, I believe. And they were really smart. They just took God out of the picture because God was going to win over the hamburger. And if they want the hamburger to be epic, then you need to get just to the transaction, the handoff, but of the product. I think that's kind of brilliant, personally. The one on the right is incredibly dumb. First of all, you're paying for 2 billboards, so it's more money. Second, by having 2 billboards, you literally destroyed the storyline. God and Adam cannot touch, by definition, because they are on separate billboards. Third thing is that, are you really suggesting that the financial advisor is infallible and equivalent to God? I think that's a stretch. Last one. So this is from Rodin's The Thinker. I think the one on the left from Honda is really pretty clever. For one thing, they took away the face and they put a screen there. What's the one thing we might look at more than a face? Yeah, our phone, our TV set, our tablet, and so forth. So a minor stroke of genius in my book. The one on the right is just terrible. This is from Whirlpool. You're really going to take Rodin's The Thinker and say, rather than philosophical thoughts, he is in the laundromat waiting for his clothes to be dry, worrying about how much lint is on them. That is coming down several notches, in my opinion. So anyway, that's that. Afterwards, some of you have already been kind enough to buy some books. I do have the art book and a lot more results from the study in the book, of course. On the left, as I mentioned, I had looked at celebrities across different occupations, Americans, from the last 40, 50 years. And on the right, I do a podcast called Dan Hill's EQ Spotlight. It's on what's called the New Books Network. It's the world's largest book review site. It's about 1.7 million downloads a month, set up by a former Harvard Russian Studies professor who decided to get out of academia and try to find a different way to connect with people. Just a wonderful guy. Anyway, 2 weeks in a row, just by chance, I had people on my podcast who mentioned that about 25% of office managers are considered to be bullies, and that's possibly a conservative estimation. And I went, oh my God, you spend all this money on company reorgs and company culture, and then you let this emotional cancer sit in your ranks with all these bullies you don't do anything about. So I thought, well, I could rant and rave about it, but I said, well, maybe humor is actually a better way to get back at this and try to change the situation. So I took contributions from people and published a version of a very famous and wonderful book called The Devil's Dictionary by Ambrose Bierce, which you may or may not know. I see at least one person is nodding. It's considered one of the 100 greatest works of American literature. Has definitions like bore, someone who talks when you want them to listen. Dentist, someone who puts metal in your mouth while taking gold from your pocket. Yankee, no such thing, see damn Yankee. Anyway, so I was trying to imitate that and have some fun, but make some points about how office life could be kinder than it very often is. So anyway, I also have that available. Now we can turn it over to the Q&A. Sure.
Light source, did that play as a focal point as well? Like I noticed the one painting where they went to the top part. There's a little bit of a light source within the dark.
Yeah.
Did you look at that at all?
I did look at that, and I really thought that was going to play stronger than it did.
Yeah.
It mostly did well with, for whatever reasons, with Spanish artists. Picasso with Guernica, for instance, and so forth. Overall, it didn't pan out. It was not as, even though there's some striking exceptions, it did not pan out as effective in drawing the eye as the face or geometric shapes or colors and so forth.
Any theory why on your part?
No, I'm not smart enough for that. That's over my pay grade. No, I don't know. I wondered about it. It just, I don't know. I do know that the colors, black and white and brown, gray, those didn't do so well. They're not as vivid. So you're working with that kind of color scheme very often. But it's often part of the storyline. They're using the illumination, and I just thought it would pull better. So my only other theory would be it's hard to tell a story in 3 to 4 seconds. People just can't put all the elements together. Whereas a bed, we go, oh yeah, I know a bed. I'm 8 hours a night in that bed. I can get there really readily. So that would be my hypothesis, such as it is. But that's a good question.
The vertical, horizontal, diagonal line.
Yeah.
I know vertical is much more intense than horizontal, et cetera.
It was in this study. I mean, yeah.
Did that play out much for you as well? Did you notice a difference as far as percentages?
You mean from the study?
Yeah.
I don't have I can't cite the numbers offhand, but it was distinctly ahead of the other two orientations. And that was not what I expected. As I said, I thought it would be the diagonal. Yeah, sure.
What's your favorite work of classical art? Or who's your favorite classical artist? Or I'm just curious.
I don't know. It might, if I had to choose, it's possible it would be Vermeer, if it wasn't Rembrandt. I've had Dutch business allies, and I really like Holland. I also like very much a joke I was once told in Holland, which was, what was the shortest book in the world? And the answer was 500 years of good German humor. And since I'm a quarter German, I can say that. But I thought it was very funny. The Dutch are very blunt and honest, almost to a fault. But I kind of like that quality in them. My biggest problem with Holland is they're so tall. And I'm not, as you might have figured out by now. I'm 5'6". My mom's 5'2". So when I'm in a Dutch business meeting, I'm always looking up. But I really do love Vermeer. And one time I was doing a study in London, and a couple of test subjects in a row didn't show up, so there was an opening in the schedule. There happened to be a Vermeer exhibit in London that was sold out. But I just got on the subway, on the underground, and I went over to the museum, and I just said to the attendant at the door, I said, I love Vermeer. This is the only time I could possibly see it. I really want to see this. And he said, I don't see you. Just go through. I never saw you. And so I got to see the Vermeer exhibit. So, yes.
Vermeer is my favorite too. I've got lots of Vermeer paintings in my house. So I've got a question for you. When you're going through these studies and you're putting them in a room, have you ever done a study where you purposely distract them, not try to get them to look at something, but distract them, so when they go back to the painting, they're looking at the same place that caught their attention in the first place? Or does this distraction have anything to do with your statistics?
Sure. Well, that's a clever question, but it's a bridge further than I got to. I can give you two things in response to that. One is someone did what I thought was a pretty interesting study where it was in a hotel lobby, and they had someone who dressed up in a monkey suit, in an ape suit, and passed through the lobby. But they were in a conversation, and it was amazing the large percentage of people who didn't notice the ape in costume going through the lobby. We can be amazingly blind as human beings. The other answer I'm going to give you is more statistical, and from my study is, and it actually be a lot of guidance, and I'm not trying to offend my kind hosts who run the museum here, but it actually was some implications for how you might want to stage exhibits. Because in my case, I just took the 90, almost 100 subjects and then almost 90 paintings, and I broke it into 3 tranches. So in other words, everybody only saw 30 works of art, because I'm looking at keeping them engaged so I can see the reactions. Even so, with just 30 works of art and really famous, great artwork, their engagement levels dropped by 10% for the last 10 pieces they saw. It came down that much, that quickly. So I don't know about you, but I've been in some massive museums, and it becomes like you're running the New York Marathon, to survive at the end. I remember one time, Rubens is not my favorite painter, for instance. And I can remember being in Vienna, and I was like, I got to get out of the museum. I have seen 140 Rubens by now, and I will be dead if I see 3 more. And I just had to get out of there. But it suggests to me that one of the things museums could do to be effective is to do what department stores do, which is to break it up into small neighborhoods or nodules and have it very thematic, not necessarily by chronology or even by artistic movement. It could be by color scheme. I mean, I certainly see things that are done by subject matter. But there could be ways in which you want to create little small pockets for people, because I think we have a tolerance level which might be a lot lower than curators sometimes imagine it is. Because you do want to avoid burnout, and I say it because I love art. And I want the artist and I want the artwork to get its best fighting chance. And I think that the really large exhibits can be difficult. And I can tell you some of my favorite museums are really small, like the Coutolde in London. It's a couple, 3 rooms. I don't know how many works of art are in there. I'm going to say 50. I remember going to Peggy Guggenheim's villa in Venice, and it's her personal collection, and there's certainly more than 50 artworks, but it's a house, and she lived in the house, and is in a great setting on the Grand Canal. So it kept me engaged by the setting and the artwork combined. And so, so those things about how we handle distractions, how long we can hang on to something, it's a complicated game. That's as far as I can take you for an answer. Yeah, so maybe a last question? Anybody else? Sure.
What about Gruber? Have you ever seen a Gruber Law Office commercial?
No, I can't say I have.
Okay.
I did once speak actually for a lawyers association on marketing in Philadelphia, and I had to scout around a bit to find some things that I thought I could point to as the successful examples of what one should do in advertising for law firms. They didn't used to advertise much, and they've stepped that up somewhat. But I have no idea what you're talking about.
Google it.
Okay, okay,
Everybody around here has seen one, and you could tell by the reaction.
okay. So anyway, I want to thank you so much. You've been a wonderful audience. Those are really great questions, and I appreciate it. And of course, yes, I've been studying all your faces as you've been listening to me. So thank you so much. Okay, thank you.